A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
You're on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil with you, the Wednesday edition of 2020, and shortly we will open our talkback lines for your insights or even personal connections to the man we'll be talking about over this next hour. It is a unique story and something of a tribute to a rugged Australian stockman, a boy from the bush who learned to talk to God and went on to found a church movement that grew to 1,600 churches around the world. Now, you might have caught the news this week of the passing of Pastor Clark Taylor, aged 87. Well, he's being remembered as one of God's great generals. We don't often get to reflect on the fact that it was a rugged Australian stockman who became Australia's first TV evangelist. Well, this year marks the 50th year since a group of 25 adults and some children met in the home of Clark and Ann Taylor in the Brisbane suburb of Capera. And that was the start of the formation of an Australian-grown church movement that became Christian outreach centres and today is called the International Network of Churches. Well, I'm joined today by Dr. Sam Hay, who tells the story of Pastor Clark Taylor as a case study in his well-researched book called Megachurches. Sam's book traces the origins and the development of megachurches in Australia, in particular through a careful and detailed study of the origins and growth of the Christian Outreach Centre movement. Dr. Sam Hay, I might say a special welcome back to 2020.
Great to be with you again, Neil, and so good to see the ministry and work that you're doing here on Vision Radio.
Hey, Sam, Clark Taylor grew up in a farming family, a boy from the bush. What have you got to reflect on so far as those early beginnings for this man?
Clark was born in 1937 to Joe and Rita Taylor on a 640-acre property at Barney View near Rathdowney, just south of Brisbane, about 70 miles. And his grandfather was a settler who founded the farm there. And then after a conversion experience at the Billy Graham Crusade, Clark recognised that something more important than farming, which he really valued, was seeing people born again, their lives transformed, and being part of the living hope that we have in Christ. And so he was very keen to share his experience with others so that they might have a similar experience to that which he had at the Billy Graham Crusade.
And you know, in a conversation like this, and some people will already be quite familiar with the story, and anybody who's been part of all of those churches that were planted in the 1970s, 1980s, they'll be familiar with the fact that here we are talking about someone who was a very gifted preacher who had a few flaws, and we'll get to some of those. But for someone who was formed, a boy from the bush, an outback farming family, when his father died in a tractor accident, he took charge of a 1 million-acre property in the Northern Territory, and it was a really huge responsibility for a young man. So he learned a lot of really good things being there in the outback as a stockman.
Yeah, certainly his experiences there and responsibilities gave him a sense of vision, a sense of hard work. He'd work long hours, and in his ministry he was always known for the time and the effort that he put in, and he communicated that with others. He also worked with others, and I think one of his great talents and abilities was to raise up other people, to give other people an opportunity, whereas other Christian organisations may want a lot of qualifications. Clark would look to the heart of a person, and if they had commitment and faith, then he'd give them the encouragement. And that's one of the reasons why he was able to help many, many people start off in ministry and become part of a great outreach work across Australia. I think Clark continues in that Methodist tradition in the 1880s through to the 1900s, where Methodism gave ordinary people a lot of opportunity, and Clark and his parents, grandparents being raised in that Methodist tradition also continued to encourage so many into leadership.
Interesting when you reflect on the fact that he was raised in a Methodist tradition in his family, because I did read a quote from him that said, I was in those days against religion. He said, I thought ministers were bludgers. And I wasn't very fussed on Americans. Quite stupid of me, but that's who I was. Very rough, very quick-tempered, very angry. So there was a certain sort of angry streak in this young man before his conversion, perhaps before his ministry training. These sorts of things, though, can be a part of ordinary people. I mean, we can all go through those sorts of things. We all have these sorts of things in our character, don't they? Don't we? As though those things that they shape us, don't they?
Yeah, I think he had a high level of authenticity in that he could really understand the human person and touch where people were at, and very openly shared with where people are at. And I think his own experiences, being raised in the bush cattle farmer with stock horses and cattlemen, gave him a sense of identity with where people are at. The passing of his own father in 1955 meant that he had a sense of wrestling with loss, and he found a similar sense of authenticity and openness in Billy Graham. That is a rugged male who was willing to tell things as they were. And I think a lot of people found in Clark something appealing in that, combined with his experience of the power of God's Spirit to transform and change things. So I think that combination of down-to-earth Aussie realism, together with a sense that with the power of God, you can do almost anything, and that God is so powerful.
Another one of those stories, isn't it? We'll hear so many of them, of people who came to faith in those Billy Graham crusades, and especially the 1959 crusades, where, as I understand it here, Clark was invited by his cousin to come along and see Billy Graham back in 1959, and Clark says he agreed because he wanted to know the price of cattle in Ipswich. So, we might go to these sorts of things with all sorts of expectations. Maybe God has his hand on our hearts when we're drawn to these things. But you know what? It didn't sound like he was very excited about going along to the Billy Graham crusade, but something must have really sparked in his heart that night.
Yeah, certainly he had a sense that he could see God really present there, almost like a vision that appeared to him at the crusade. And I think his desire was always to see God actively at work and to hear God. He was passionate about hearing God speak in his life. This notion that if God is real, he wanted to know everything about what God could do. But then he visited Papua New Guinea and caught malaria, and again he cried out to God. And then Reverend Godfrey Williams, who wrote the book God Wills Your Healing, prayed for him, and again he had experience of God. And I think one thing Methodism and John Wesley really emphasise is having this personal experience of God, both in salvation and conversion, being born again, but also as a daily experience of God speaking to you, which I think is very much what Clark sought to know and did know, and then communicated with others, which is so valuable for bringing our Christian faith alive.
You know, Sam, I always feel so comfortable talking to you about issues. And while we're focusing our conversation on Clark Taylor, there's all sorts of things that come to mind. And we'll get to the Methodism and the Pentecostalism very shortly. But just touch here for a moment, because, as you say, when Clark went on a missionary endeavour to Papua New Guinea, he contracted cerebral malaria. And that's something that's pretty serious. He was suffering seizures for years and years, but it was a healing that he himself personally received from that malaria that increased his understanding about, God and miraculous things. How do you reflect on his personal experience there of receiving healing from God, and that might be something that fueled his own ministry purposes? Any thoughts?
Well, I think it's interesting that Clark, with his Methodist background, doesn't escape the realities of life. He sought to establish a medical centre here in Brisbane at one centre, which would be a Christian medical centre. He sought to establish help for the homeless, help for all sorts of people facing challenges. And often when one would hear him preaching, he'd take time to preach on the importance of salvation and take time to preach on the importance of healing. But one notes also in that Methodist tradition, he'd reflect on the challenges of everyday life and the everyday wisdom. And so I think it was quite a balanced teaching that he had, which I think fits with the Australian character of being balanced and down to earth as well. And so while there are traditions of healing, I think he speaks of healing within a discussion of other real things that are happening, which to me I think shows a lot of healthy balance, which was found in the Methodist Church.
Some of us get hung up on the issue around miracles. From what I understand, he received a message from God telling him to obey James chapter 5. And in James chapter 5, we can read all about the prayer of faith. Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. Even if they've sinned, they'll be forgiven. Those sorts of powerful words. Something must have just clicked in his spirit to be able to sort of take things to a different level than what he might have been used to as he was training as a Methodist preacher.
Yeah, I think he very much believed in a real experience of God that was grounded in just reality. I remember speaking to Reverend Godfrey Williams, who prayed for him to be healed, and it seemed to me Godfrey was more out there with the spiritual things than Clark, who spoke about the reality of the experience that he had known and then pressing through. So I think it's interesting that Clark didn't just disappear off with the mysterious. He very much applied it back into real life. And I think Australians always identified with that, this connection with heaven and the hope that we have in God, but also connection with that this power can make a difference in your life and in mine in everyday experience. And that's what makes it real and important.
And, you know, just interesting here to reflect, because we're talking about Methodism, we're talking about Pentecostalism, and you mentioned Reverend Godfrey. Well, he was, as I understand it, an Assemblies of God pastor. So for listeners today, Australian Christian churches, formerly known as the Assemblies of God in Australia. So there's an awful lot of interaction, isn't there, between these denominations and even now the formation of a new denomination as it was under COC. But there's this interaction, and the things that shape us, sometimes we don't give as much credence to those things that, come from different ways we think about faith. Any thoughts here on the fact that someone's upbringing under a particular faith tradition can change when God gets a hold of a heart?
Yeah, I once asked Clark Taylor about these different influences, and he said there are many streams flow into the river of the lively Christian faith of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, including Methodism and Assemblies of God and the Presbyterian and lots of other dynamic, alive faiths. But the important thing is God's present amongst us. And so Godfrey Williams, who was the Oxford Methodist Church, had an influence. And then there was Frank Fullwood, who was a former Methodist who had joined the Assemblies of God, who had an influence. And then there was Trevor Chandler from New Zealand, who had an influence. And so all of these people represent a living, vital faith that came through. And I think we need to remember this is more than just men. This is actually God's Spirit at work. This is the message of the living Christ. This is Father God moving through his Spirit in the lives of many, many people. And so I think Clark and others would want us to focus on what God was doing and this revival that was taking place. And I think very much it was a revival with Billy Graham visiting and sharing the gospel message in 1959, and maybe 10% of Australians going along, being born again and changing the world, and then people being filled with the Spirit during the 60s and 70s. We could see God's hand on all of this, and I think that's what people are seeking today too, isn't it? When they go to hear the preaching, is not just the name of the preacher, they're seeking to have a sense that God is speaking to them. And I think that's something that Clark was able to communicate, that God is speaking to you, the living God who's able to save and deliver.
Visions 2020 with Neil Johnson. A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events.
Well, honouring one of those Christian leaders today who's been described as one of the great generals of Christian faith here in Australia. We're talking about Clark Taylor, who died this week. Dr. Sam Hay is our guest. He tells the story of Clark Taylor in his book called Megachurches. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might have your own recollection. You might have a question even about his character, some flaws in his character too. We'll get to those as we unpack some more of the story. But 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation today. 1-800-316-316. Hey, Sam, he hit the airwaves in 1977. This was something a little different to what was, expected of Australians in that day, but a program called A New Way of Living. Do you remember it?
I do remember the impact it had, and I chatted to Brian Millis, who was an experienced television journalist with Channel 10, Channel O at the time, and he edited and put these programs together. I think it cost about $2,000 a week. There wasn't so much on the telly of a Sunday morning, a little bit of sport, and so Channel 10 or Channel 0 were open to the possibility of putting this on. And since the 1950s, television had spread in America, Australia and Europe, and people were looking for something. And that raised a whole discussion as to what people are looking for in terms of screens and presentation. But certainly it's a way of really communicating the good news that Clark and his team were able to put together. And it had a huge impact on Australia through 1977 through to around 1982, 83, the early 80s. Yeah.
And of course, the TV certainly fueled, didn't it, rapid growth of the Christian outreach movement through the 1980s. So this was, well, all of a sudden you're on TV. Well, the church is going to grow. In some sense, you might say, well, the marketing, the promotion, the advertising for the church, clearly that was a very big benefit to the growth of the Christian outreach centres.
And also it was a challenge then to, again, communicate the authenticity and the reality of what was happening in an encounter with God and Jesus. And I think Clark was well positioned, and the team that he had with Brian Millis and others were well positioned to make this a very authentic, real experience. And we've just gone through, the COVID experience where people have rediscovered the power of media. And so you don't have to be disconnected. In the home groups, Clark introduced video recorders, so that people during the middle of the week, wherever you were in Australia, you could still engage with those there. So it was very innovative in terms of music, in terms of preaching. He certainly brought a fresh wave of innovation into what was happening in our churches here in Australia.
Well, 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Diane is in Chinchilla. Hey, Diane, welcome along.
Actually, it's Deanne, but I'm in Chinchilla.
Okay, Deanne. Deanne, you knew Clark for years.
Oh, look, I just want to honour him right now. He became a big part of our lives, and my mum and dad's life. He went and ministered in their church in Mount Isa. And Clark was just such a beautiful man. I was there when he got baptised in water at the Windsor Full Gospel Church in Windsor with Pastor Munro and Pastor Chandler.
Wow.
And it was absolutely wonderful. That just come back to me afresh today, or yesterday it was, and it's just like seeing him come out the front because God said, "I'll meet you in the waters."
Diane, what do you remember about the charisma of Clark Taylor? Because he was an imposing figure, wasn't he? And a very strong-willed speaker.
Very much so, very much so. He spoke a lot into my husband and my life, and he always remembered your name. You know, we went to his big church in Brisbane, and he'd look up and see us there, and he always remembered it. And it used to always stick out to me, you care. You care, Clark. Sorry.
That's right.
You know, just lovely man, and my condolences to his family and friends, and he's just a beautiful man, and I praise God I got to know him. Just a beautiful man.
Diane, wonderful. Sam, any thoughts here for Deanne?
I had a similar experience that he'd always remember your name, he'd remember your background, he'd ask about different things that were happening in your life, and he'd always show care, he'd show you to a seat, and he'd introduce you to others. And I think he really was a pastor's pastor in that sense, which was lovely.
Well, Deanne, thank you so much for your call, your contribution, and our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Love to hear from you if you have some recollection. You might even have your own recollection of, you know, singing along with the opening tune to the TV program New Way of Living. I've found a new way of living. I've found a new life divine. I have the fruit of the Spirit. I'm abiding in the vine. I think that was the way the words went. But Deanne, thank you so much. 1800 316 316 to contribute to our conversation. Now, it wasn't just church, but before we get on to some of the other things that developed around his ministry, just quickly, Sam, church at its peak, with the television program A New Way of Living airing on the airwaves, there was something in the vicinity of 4,000 people. Almost 4,000 people turning up to church on a Sunday. That was pretty unheard of back in the 1970s and early 80s, wasn't it?
Well, very much so, and it became Australia's largest church in 1988 with expansion. They moved to Mansfield, and then the church kept expanding and expanding. You always wanted a movable wall at the back so that it could expand and expand further, and that was part of his vision. He'd moved from having a vision to build more cattle stations and raise more cattle to seeing people born again, and seeing more and more people coming to experience God's salvation. And he just wanted to grow and grow the church that would be able to communicate that message. And certainly on itinerant travel in New Zealand, he saw a lot of people born again and healed. But then he also recognised the importance of building a church base, a family where people could continue to have fellowship over times. And so the COC was then developed in planting churches across Australia and then globally around the world.
Taking calls, 1800 316 316. Let's hear from Karen, who's in Slacks Creek in Queensland. Hi, Karen. Welcome along.
G'day. Yeah.
Karen, what are your thoughts?
Oh, look, a few things. I still quote some of Clark's stories to people because, hey, we overcome the enemy by the power of the blood and the word of our testimony. And even if it's not ours, it's Clark. He'd talk about his horses. One was a goggle-eyed stargazer, and I'm not going to finish the story, but I often tell that story to people and attribute it to Clark. And he had a lovely saying. He said, God has his queer ones and his dear ones, but we're all loved by God. Yeah, he had his strange foibles, of course, but like everybody, but he was a top guy. And when his first son, I think, got married, I stood in the kitchen with 150 or 300 other women and men making sandwiches for 3,000 people who were coming to the wedding. And I stood beside a dear friend, Rosalind, who stayed friends with me all this time. And she moved off to Israel and lives there now. And I visited her twice. But, we used to enjoy our theological conversations together because of the teaching of Clark. And my faith grew. I was just so blessed by him. Yeah.
Karen, wonderful insight. A thought of yours, Dr. Sam Hay, for Karen?
I like what you said about him having his foibles, and he would admit his failings, and certainly people would know from newspapers that there is a fall that takes place in Clark's life, but then there's also a restoration that takes place. And so I think he does reflect aspects of humanity. I think through it all he sought to know God, to know Jesus, to know salvation and the Spirit, and to be able to see God at work. And so he knew what it meant even when he was moving from farming, to not be able to read, but to look to God, and then to learn, to face challenges in life and to look to God and learn. So I think he's both very human, but also someone who finds in God a lot of hope and vitality and ways to communicate that hope to others, I think, that has touched lots of lives, as you mentioned. Yeah.
Karen in Slacks Creek, thank you so much for your call. Great contribution there, Karen. Just coming up to news just a minute and a half away. You know, when we talk about telling stories, it's interesting, isn't it? Even as Karen was reflecting, standing around making sandwiches, the theological conversations that ordinary people don't necessarily have. But when you've got someone who is a storyteller and brings out the best in you, Sam, just very quickly, that sort of magnetic personality, telling stories, but inspiring people to talk about faith, that was important.
Oh, very much so. I think Clark would include some very powerful stories about what it was like, and I think many of us would remember his stories of being a stockman and the cattle, and them rushing towards the water, and so I think he really communicated what it was like in the outback. But then he brought in the reality of the experience of God and Jesus, and that combination sort of made it real and alive for all those who heard him. So it was wonderful.
Before we go any further, though, Sam, let's talk about this fall from grace. Because Pastor Neil Myers took over the COC in 1990 after it was revealed that Clark Taylor had an affair with his secretary. And that made front page news at the time. How do you reflect on that time?
I think certainly there's a reality. People are always interested in the scandal size, the black spot on the shirt. But I think the other side of the coin is that Clark raised up people like Neil Myers, gave him opportunity and support. And in 1977, after they'd developed the Brisbane church, Clark encouraged the growth of the church there at Nambour, and then down in New South Wales with David McDonald, Clark encouraged the growth of that. So I think the fact that he poured his life and time out into other people meant that there were a good number of other people who could follow on. And so I think it shows the value of not just building on your own strengths and weaknesses and life, but building on God and building into other people's lives. So, I can see the other side of it as well, as that, he raised up a good number of other people who continued on the work of God, rather than just focusing on the spot of where we fail, because I guess we all fail in some ways.
Challenging, isn't it, when you've got a sort of messiah complex that some people have of a leader, and the thought that, there's no impurity in this leader. And of course, he did have some flaws. As I understand it, reported that when those revelations of an extramarital affair surfaced, he fled to America, worked the Christian circuit in America for a decade. And when he came back, or even during that time, was very candid about his fall from grace. Someone who was able to talk about his own challenges. How did you reflect on that from your dealings with Clark Taylor, the things that you researched, the things that you've studied about his life? How did you, understand his ability to talk about those things?
He was always open to see what God would do both here and in the US. I think he'd always gone to the US before, and there was always an openness to people in the US to Crocodile Dundee and that. But I don't know that Clark fled there. I think he saw opportunity there, continued, and he saw opportunity in Australia. He continued to minister in Australia. Though the COC wisely sought to maintain a position of honour and to not give opportunity for Clark there, in that it was important to honour respect and all of those things. So, Clark had to wrestle through with that. He also sought to earn a good living through growing palms and hard work. And so I think, he poured time here in Australia over the next 10 years or so into hard work in both ministry opportunity and also in hard work such as the Palms and other things as well. So I think he showed a lot of integrity there. And then also at the end of that period of time, when he asks Anne, he realises then that one way to go forward is to seek restoration of relationship with his first wife around 1999, and so he certainly is open to the churches and says this is what he's going to do. And then again he steps out in faith about age 61, and we see the worship centre, another centre outreach grow, and a lot of people went along there and saw, real move of God continue through his ministry. So I think there is a certain level of authenticity and reality. There's so much we can learn from a person's journey in life, particularly when they're open and quite transparent about things that happen. And I think we see that in Clark Taylor's life. And then I think we also need to move beyond just looking to people to ask, what's God doing? And so one of the things that I see is that COC and INC is not just a product of one man or a product of 100 or 200 very faithful people, but it's also a product of a move of God and people being open to what God is doing. It's part of a charismatic revival movement through the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. So I think sometimes it's good to look to God and what he's doing instead of just focusing on aspects of a human person's life journey.
And it's typical, isn't it, that we can very quickly jump to judgment, and yet we have a Bible full of flawed characters, so we might not expect that any modern leaders might actually be any different and have a few flaws in there too. And interesting, though, as you do reflect on that reconciliation with his wife, which won back some of the supporters who'd felt betrayed by his very public moral failures. Hey, 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation as we are talking about Pastor Clark Taylor, who died this week. One of those who was a friend and follower is Pinky. And Pinky, well known to listeners as a famous truck driver. Pinky, are you out in your truck today?
No, Neil, I'm actually up at Toowoomba having lunch with the brain, my lovely wife, Marita.
Okay. Hey, Pinky, I know you've got a connection here to Clark Taylor. What are your insights?
Yes, well, Clark was my uncle, my father's brother. And I had, being the oldest in my family, I was sent to my grandma, which is Clark's mum. And so each year I used to be able to come down and spend time with Grandma. And, of course, she took me to church. And I was actually privileged to be in every one of Clark's churches that he started. He started in his lounge room, like I said, at Camira, and I was there for that. And Grandma supported him all the way through on his ministry. And all the other churches that we went to, there was one in the Valley and then eventually got out to Mansfield. So I was blessed to experience all the different movements over the years. and the tent revivals, and the worship centre. The week that they opened that, I actually was in Brisbane, and I gave my uncle a call, and he said that he was opening a new church. So I bobtailed the truck around to the worship centre, and I was there the first day it was open. So I got to see that one too.
What an amazing story. So you have experienced what we're talking about here when we discuss Clark Taylor and even revival conditions. You would have been there when thousands and thousands were turning out to church on Sunday, and the television ministry, and have seen those small beginnings and right through to the rise to the heights. So you were there, Pinky.
Yeah, well, I was actually part of the TV ministry in Mansfield when I come back down. I moved. My uncle, the Lord showed Uncle that there was something going on up in Tully where I was, and he rang the office phone as I walked through the door in the morning and said to me, any time you want to come and have a holiday or come down and see us, you're quite welcome, and opened the door for me. And that actually opened the door to my dad getting saved as well, because I told him I was going to Brisbane, and he said, I'm coming too. So, long story short, my dad got saved through that as well. And when I came down at 19, I was a part of the TV ministry on the camera and behind the scenes and that. So, yeah, I was a big part of that ministry, and it was a very strong ministry too. A lot of testimonies come out of that TV ministry.
A lot of testimonies, a lot of miracles, and you probably had the camera focused on people who were giving testimonies of miracles on the television programs and such things. Hey, all good to talk about those things. I wonder if I ask you, some of these sensitive things. You've joined us at a time when we've just been talking about what happened with Clark and his affair with the secretary, and some of those things that went beyond that. I know I'm talking to you now, close as a family member. You were his nephew. How did the family handle all of that? And when we're talking about the authenticity of Clark and his ability to then be able to be authentic and talk about these things openly, have you got a thought or two around that, Pinky, as a family member?
Well, it goes two ways with that, Neil. Being a family member, that puts you in touch with the person, but being a Christian, it puts you in touch with the Lord. Now, the Lord says, do not judge. So being a family member, you know the heart of the person that's involved. And what keeps coming back to me, I think it was Billy Graham, was it, Neil, that said that he wouldn't be in the presence of a woman without somebody else there with him.
Yep, that's right.
Uncle should have taken that on board, I'd imagine, which is all good in hindsight. I think where the church was at, it's around 4,500 to 5,000 at Mansfield. There was a lot of responsibility, a lot of things happening. And I think the guard got let down, as one would say. And, when that happened, I think everyone just took a deep breath and held judgment until because he'd done the right thing by the church. He announced what he'd done. And as it did, all these things do happen, as people are out there listening, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence until you chew the grass down, and then you find there's just as many weeds. So he found that there was that problem, and then asked for repentance, and he asked Auntie Anne for repentance, and she gave it, and so that they healed that problem, and they've had a beautiful relationship right through to now. And so from a family member, I applauded all the actions that were put in place and asked for forgiveness and stuff. That was good. And from a Christian side of things, I didn't pass judgment on it. I just waited for what the Lord had in his life, because he's a very powerful man in the spirit. So.
Yeah. Pinky, I'm just so thrilled that you've called through, and just to appreciate this connection. And as we are honouring Clark Taylor today, just to hear your heartbeat on that and hear the family's heartbeat. Now, I got to say, I don't know what funeral arrangements there might be, and you may not be at liberty to share if there's some things that are happening privately, but do you know if there is some sort of public memorial or what might be happening around funeral arrangements?
Linda, my cousin, and Robin, my cousin. That's his daughters. They're looking into that now. As you can appreciate, it's going to be a fairly big thing or big event. There hasn't been announced at this stage, but I did say to DJ the other morning that I'll ask Marita to post on the Vision website as soon as we get details, and I'll give heads up to DJ as well to the morning show that it is on the website if people want to respond to that when it does come available.
I think there'll be some listeners who'll really be interested in that, and those who might be around the local area when that happens, and those who've had a long experience, and we're talking 50 years here, that might want to be a part of just remembering this man, Clark Taylor. Hey, Pinky, there was a book written about Clark by his daughter. Is that your cousin or
my cousin? Yeah,
your
my cousin Linda.
And as Dr. Sam Hay, who's with us also on the call here, was saying that in the book that his daughter wrote, there's something of the authenticity of the man that is revealed. Any thoughts here on your Uncle Clark and the fact that he was such an authentic man in the sense of openness, that transparency when he had fallen short of the mark? But that was actually something that added in so many people's minds to his reputation. Any thoughts here from you?
Well, as you say, it's the man from the bush or the boys from the bush. His upbringing, same as my dad's upbringing, that was like red dirt, hard slog. The stories that come from Uncle Clark and my dad about the younger days and their dad dying, ploughing the fields at night time and hit a rock in the tractor. And Grandma didn't know why he didn't come for breakfast, and they went looking for him, and unfortunately he'd passed, which put the responsibility back on the children then to help Grandma, because they had Gumpala Station at the time up in the Northern Territory, as well as the desert. Anyway, in saying that, the upbringing they had in the hardness, I think, was what God used in Clark. That powerful, or how would you say it? It is that hardness, where you've been. You can take the knocks and the bangs and get up. You can ride a Brumby and get thrown 3 times, and then in the end, you've broken it. Well, I think he used that really hardy strength and character of Clark, and that's what shines through in his using the Holy Spirit and watching him with working in the Spirit, that power that he can just handle because of the nature of his upbringing. If you can understand that, Neil.
Pinky, absolutely wonderful insight. And I might just bring Dr. Sam Hay in here, because when we reflect on a hard upbringing and the resilience that comes from, the idea of the rugged stockman, and life is not easy if you're working out on a cattle property or in charge of a huge property as he was there at one stage. The thought, Sam Hay, that somehow or other we want to make things comfortable or expect our own comfort and nice things and good things always, that doesn't necessarily align with what we're reading in the Bible or what we're seeing in the lives of great leaders. Any thoughts from you here, Sam?
I think, we talked before about the possibility of Clark falling as the movement reached a point of success and a point of possible comfort. And you read similar in the Old Testament with King David, when he reaches that point of comfort, there's a danger in that. And then also the idea, as was mentioned, this notion that you don't, as Billy Graham said, you don't have time alone with one woman when you're travelling, etc., but you always have others around and accountability. I think these are organisational things, and we see it with finances. That is, we're always told that when you count the money, you have other people around and you check. In terms of pride, you're always careful that others are organising things as well, and you're not the only person making decisions. With alcohol, you've got other people that you're accountable to. And so I think a lot of these things are wisdom and organisational, and that there's a humanness about us. And I think one of the great things that stands out in Clark's story is that this tough times can really make you tough, but at the same time, you don't have to lose your humanity and your caring for one another. The tough times can make you into a better person. And I think you see that in the authenticity of Clark and in his remarriage to Anne. I think you see that Clark sought to become a better person through the tough times and the setbacks rather than allow them to bring him down.
Well, I want to say a special thank you to Pinky. Pinky, you had something more to add?
I was just going to say, Sam, you couldn't have put that a better way, because he did understand that he was misled, or one would say, or took the wrong path, and he took accountability for what he did, and he did get down on bended knee and ask Anne if he could, if she forgave him, that he'd be honest in that, and it did make him a better man, and right to his death. I did have a lot to do with Uncle and Auntie, and it's good to see that repair done and it was fixed.
Well, Pinky, thank you so much. I think you've just put the icing on the cake for a conversation as we're honouring and talking about the life of Pastor Clark Taylor, who died this week, and Pinky as his nephew. Just such valuable insight, and certainly taking us back to that very first meeting and the formation of the COC, and being on the camera on the television program, A New Way of Living. Pinky, thank you so much for taking some time to just call us and to share your thoughts with us today on 2020. Sam, almost out of time. We need to wrap things up. Just quickly, just talking about, it's very well to talk about building a huge warehouse-style church that would seat 5,000 people. But he also went on to establish the Bible College, and there was a whole bunch of different areas of development. The City Point Christian College in Toowoomba, the Highlands Christian College in Nambour, Queensland, the Sun Coast Christian College near Woombai. There was the Christian Heritage College, a tertiary training institution for school teachers and people who are studying social science and Christian ministry. There's a lot of different accolades in those things that have been formed from this man's ministry. Any thoughts here on what goes on from this time forward? 1,600 churches around the world and no one stopping the INC. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering that this is a unique movement, an Australian movement started by an Australian stockman, the Crocodile Dundee of the spiritual world in Australia. It's broader than, say, an American Pentecostalism that begins in the 1914s. It's part of a charismatic movement that also grows out of Methodist Church that's richly influenced Australia through the 1880s through the 1900s. So it could also be called a charismatic Methodist church, charismatic church and movement. It's part of what God was doing through the 60s, 70s, 80s, connects with Billy Graham. And there's so many rich aspects of what God was doing through Clark and that time. So it's an opportunity to not just reflect on a man's journey in ministry, but to also celebrate what God has done and the privilege that so many had to being a part of what God was doing in and through Clark's life and through the family. And so I think it's a time to celebrate, a time to be thankful for the blessings of God that's apparent in so many areas. And so the growth of, big church, we call it Megachurch, shouldn't overlook what's happening in every individual life, and each of the smaller groups as well. We can celebrate a great deal as we celebrate Clark's life at this time.
And I think that'll be something of a breath of fresh air for some listeners when you think of COC or the INC and describing it as a charismatic Methodist church. Hey, to connect with Dr. Sam Hay, and he's got an in-depth discovery of all sorts of dimensions of Pastor Clark Taylor's life, studied him as a case study for his book called Megachurches, and focuses on the origins and the growth of the Christian Outreach Centre movement. You could look for that Megachurches book at good online booksellers. You can also find Sam Hay, Dr. Sam Hay, on Facebook and other social media. You can connect with him too at the Alpha Crucis College, where he is lecturing. He also does some continued teaching with the Christian Heritage College, where in Brisbane, which was founded, of course, by Clark Taylor. Those you can certainly Google those online and connect with Dr. Sam Hay. Sam, always good getting your insights. I want to thank you so much for taking some time to share those with us today on 2020.
So good. If I can finish with Mark 11:23, do not doubt in your heart, but if we believe what will happen, it'll be done for us. That is, faith is so important. Just some words from Clark that I remember him saying.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.